Right, hi everyone, welcome. Good afternoon. Throw my mask off over there. My name is Natalie Knox, and I am the gallery manager here at Frank. We are honored that Mirinda Kossoff chose our space to launch her incredible achievement, the release of her book, The Rope of Life. We invite you to sit back, listen, and enjoy Mirinda's interview with fellow author Nora Gaskin and a sampling from Mirinda's book. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the comment section of this video on our Facebook page. And during the last 15 minutes, we'll do an open question and answer session. A little bit about Mirinda. Mirinda has been a chameleon in her work life, from social worker, assistant managing editor at the News and Observer, communications director in academia and nonprofits, freelancer to metalsmith and jewelry designer, and member artist in Frank Gallery. Her essays and creative writing have been passions she pursued alongside her day jobs. She penned a weekly column for a local paper, was an essayist and commentator on regional public radio, and taught essay writing at Duke University. The Rope of Life is her first book. Nora Gaskin is a lifelong resident of the Durham-Chapel Hill area and the author of 2 novels called Until Proven, A Mystery in 2 Parts, and The Worst Thing. She also penned a nonfiction book about that Christmas Eve murder called Time of Death, to further explore the questions it raised. She lives and writes in Chatham County, inspired by her native landscape, her husband, and dogs. Her favorite word is gratitude. And without further ado, I will pass the floor to Nora to begin her discussion with Mirinda.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you to the Frank Gallery for having us. Thanks also to McIntyre's for being the bookstore sponsor of this great event. Mirinda, it was a great pleasure for me to work with you editing and publishing The Rope of Life. I'm really pleased and proud to be associated with you and with this book in any way. There's something I don't think I said to you when we were working on the book. There was really no need at the time, but I want to say it out loud now. I believe in storytelling. I believe that when we tell each other our stories, that's where we find our common humanity. Real storytelling allows us to learn from each other. It means that the listener and the reader and the storyteller get beyond and beneath the layers in which their life experience is so different, and they find the place where we all draw from the common well of humanity. I think that The Rope of Life is a great example of that kind of storytelling, and I'm just so pleased to be associated with it. Would you start by reading to us a little bit, please? Read us some of The Rope of Life.
I'd be happy to. I just want to say my thanks. You've already said them, Nora, but I have to say them too. I want to thank you, Nora, for sharing this event with me and for all the support and guidance you gave me as you were editing and publishing my book. I want to thank McIntyre's Books for being the bookseller for this event. And I especially want to thank my home away from home, Frank Gallery, this beautiful, wonderfully curated gallery that just makes me happy to come into. So with that said, I'm going to read the prologue to the book because it kind of sets the tone for the book and for my relationship with my father, which this book is primarily about, among other things. On one of my weekend visits home, Dad asked if I wanted to go up in a Cessna with him. Despite my concerns about his health and his ability to fly the plane, I agreed. I didn't want to disappoint him, nor did I want him to think I had lost confidence in him. Dad had flown in World War II, and his wartime memories must have figured large in his renewing his pilot's license at age 50. The Cessna 172 Skyhawk wasn't simply a quick way for Dad to get to the Outer Banks. For fishing weekends, the Cessna was youth, adventure, camaraderie, and risking life in the service of an idea. We took off from the strip behind the house near Danville for a flyover of Smith Mountain Lake, about 60 miles away, and our cottage with its dock and motorboat. As Dad eased the Cessna into the sky and we gained altitude, I saw the tops of the pine trees surrounding our house and felt the plane shudder as it hit air currents higher up. "Geez, Dad," I said, "I've never been in a plane this small. It feels like we're puppets on a string, being dangled by some giant hand." "Yup, it's great, isn't it?" Dad replied, looking left and down from his window. "But I'm the one who's in control." As he said this, I noticed he was sweating. I was not reassured, but I kept this feeling to myself. "I don't have a transponder in this plane yet," Dad murmured offhandedly, "so I'll have to navigate by landmarks." Oh, great, now he tells me. Then I reminded myself that Dad had flown to the Outer Banks and back several times without incident, that Roger and Kip had survived a couple of flights. So what was I worrying about? "Well, which landmarks are we looking for?" I asked, wanting to be helpful and at the same time wanting to be sure he was on top of it. "We're going to fly west to Martinsville and then up 220 until I see Route 40 to Smith Mountain," Dad said. "But how can you tell? There are so many roads down there." "I can see the main route and I can see Martinsville. After that, we'll follow the road north until it joins 40. To me, the landscape below was a jumble of trees and ribbons of road. I had to believe that Dad was better at picking out landmarks than I. During the war, hadn't he found bombing targets from above? "There it is," he said, jabbing his finger in the air below his window. I looked down and saw the ragged edge of shoreline and the sun glinting diamonds off the surface of the lake. And below was our lakefront cottage, looking like a large Monopoly game piece, up the hill from a miniature dock. Remember when I learned to ski and tried to slalom with a non-slalom ski? I twisted my knee when I fell and had to be on crutches when I went back to college that fall. Remember that, Dad? "Yeah, sure," Dad said absently. He was focusing on the scene below. "I've lost track of 220. We're running low on gas, and I know there's a quicker way back. I'll have to find some different landmarks." A surge of fear heated up my intestines, but I stayed mum. I didn't want to distract him, and I knew I was of no use in helping him navigate us home. "Well, I'm not sure where we are right now," Dad chuckled. Maybe he could make light of our situation with false bravado, but it sure wasn't working for me. "How much longer do we have on the fuel that's left?" I asked. "We'll get there before it runs out." "Well, that sure is a relief," I said, not meaning to be sarcastic, but fear had overcome tact. "Ah, we're east of Martinsville. I can see 54. He sighed, and I exhaled a sigh of relief too. Almost home, almost safe. But then I realized we had to land. As the Cessna's wings teetered on approach to the strip of turf behind the house, I could see Dad clench the steering wheel. He was sweating and breathing hard and seemed to have deflated like a tire losing air. I held my breath and gripped the edges of my seat while Dad concentrated on the airstrip between the groves of pine trees below. He made one pass at the strip, but then pulled up and circled around for another try. As he finally set the wheels down, we bounced like a rubber ball until the Cessna mercifully rolled to a stop, and I spilled out of the cockpit, so delirious to be back on solid ground that I wanted to kneel like the Pope and kiss the ground. "Well, Dad, that was quite a ride," I said, more heartily than I was feeling. "Next time I'll give us a smoother landing," he said. "Right, Dad," I replied, thinking that there wasn't going to be a next time for me. I'd proven my loyalty, and once would have to be enough. My father had always been a mystery to me, a puzzle comprising many pieces I could never put together. Even as I climbed into the Cessna with him, He was remote and unreadable. He was 53 years old then, not old, and I was 30, not a child, and we were at a crossroads. Debilitating back pain had reduced him to a phantom of his former, hyperactive, optimistic self. His confidence was shaky. He worked less and less. He was not the father I knew growing up, the one I looked up to as fearless, strong, funny, protective, and controlling. After college, I fled my hometown to live in Japan, followed a few years later by 9 months in England. While my world was expanding, his was shrinking. It frightened me to learn the extent to which he had withered while I was living my life apart from his. Okay, I'm being told to be a little bit louder. So I hope you all were able to hear that first section. The last reading I'm going to do is a very short chapter, but it is the chapter about the last time I saw my father alive. 6 months after Grandpa Herman's death, Dad entered the University of Virginia Hospital in Charlottesville. He had threatened suicide enough that he was put on the psychiatric unit under 24 hours suicide watch. Finally, the doctors focused on his mental and emotional state. They wanted to referee a meeting between Mom and Dad to try and understand the dynamic between them and get them to talk to each other. My mother was like Dad in that she never talked about anything remotely resembling a feeling. Although she dreaded the visit with the doctors, she dutifully complied, but she didn't want to go alone. Whether she asked me or whether she asked one of my siblings first, I don't know, but she asked me, and I agreed. It would mean rearranging my work schedule at the American Dance Festival and finding additional childcare for Max and Drew. Mom drove us to Charlottesville because she would never ride with me. I assumed it was because she wanted to be in control, at least in that aspect of her life. We were both keyed up when we arrived at the hospital for the meeting with Dad's doctors. They told us they were having a hard time getting through to him, and that perhaps he would open up a bit to Mom. Not very likely, I thought to myself. I stayed in the waiting room, reading to distract myself until the session was over. When Mom appeared, she looked drained and told me that Dad wouldn't say much. The session had been a bust. We went into Dad's room on the psych wing. Dad lay on his back in the bed, picking at the sheets. The sour odor of his sweat and unwashed body permeated the room. His forehead had an oily sheen. He launched his boat of woes even as we were trying to drift in another direction. "Jean," he said to me, "you've got to get me out of here." It was more of an order than a plea. "I can't take it in this place. They've done nothing for me." He didn't look directly at me, but at the wall beside me across from his bed. "Dad, in the last 2 years, you've been in at least 4 hospitals, and you say the same thing at every place. I want you to get me back into the VA in Durham." Here we go again, I thought. I was frustrated, angry, and weary of the months of visiting him in hospitals, trying to cheer him up the way he had cheered me when I was a kid. "When you were at the VA, all you wanted was to get out. You said they didn't help you there either. I can't do this, Dad." "Yes, you can." He twisted the sheet in his right hand. I wanted to make things different, make him whole again, but he was beyond reasoning with, and I felt helpless. A surge of anger heated up my spine. We had played out this scene many times before. "I love you, Dad," I said, "but I can't let you manipulate me anymore." And I walked out of his room, my heart banging hard against my ribs and my whole body shaking.
Thank you, Mirinda. Two very important parts of the book, very important passages. I want to talk a little bit more about your relationship with your father first, and then we'll go on to some of the other themes in the book. You clearly adored your father as a young child, and you loved to hear him tell his stories from World War II. How and when did that relationship with your father change? And looking back, what do you see the turning points to have been?
Well, I think the first major turning point was the birth of my brother, who was the third in line. I'm the eldest, and I have three younger siblings. My father made no secret of the fact that he wanted a son. He desperately wanted a son. And when that son finally came, and hadn't been planned for, but was a wonderful surprise, my father turned his attention to that son, my brother. And as my brother got older, my father spent all of his spare time with my brother, introducing him to hunting and fishing and shooting at tin cans in the backyard with the German Luger he brought back from World War II. All the things that dads and sons do. I, on the other hand, was sidelined from my dad's attention, which he had generously given me when I was younger and the only child. So that was the first time. And I would say the second big change in our relationship came after I left for college. Um, Being in college at William and Mary was an eye opener for me. Um, I majored in sociology because the Vietnam War was raging at the time, and sociology seemed like such an apropos major to have at the time, to study why these things were happening and why there was such division in our culture about the war. And I became an active anti-war protester in college, and I would come home and visit on holidays, and Dad and I would have what we called the dinner table debates. And the rest of the family looked like they were watching a ping pong match because I would speak and Dad would speak, and we were at opposite sides. I was against the war, he was for the war, he was worried about communism, he was a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. So things really changed between us then, though we still loved each other, and I still wanted to please him, and I still wanted him to be proud of me. And I think in a way, he respected my ability to argue my point of view. And I still respected him as my father. And then as I became a mother and had a demanding life of my own, I began to see how emotionally remote he had been, how different he was from some of my friends' fathers. And that, I guess, was another turning point.
Understandably, yeah. It's been well established, and any of us who have siblings know this, that no two children growing up in the same household with the same parents have exactly the same experience from that growing up. How do you think your experience was different than your younger siblings might have been, and how did that shape the family?
Well, the oldest child is always the starter child, the practice kid, one who gets the bulk of the expectations from the parents. I felt I had to be perfect. I had to make straight A's. I also felt greatly under their thumbs. They expected a lot from me, and a lot of chores, a lot of responsibility. As the younger siblings came along, of course, the attention was turned to them, taking care of them, all the demands of new infants and toddlers. So that relieved some of the pressure, but there was more pressure for me to help look after the younger ones and to be an example. I've always envied the middle child because the middle child seems to be the one who can do his or her own thing.
We won't ask the middle children to debate that right now, but that could be a subject for another day. Your nuclear family lived in a small southern town in Western Virginia in the mountains, but your extended family was much more widespread, including your Jewish grandparents, your father's family from New York. Tell us about your Jewish grandfather and your relationship with him.
Grandpa Herman David Kossoff, who immigrated from Russia as a boy, he and my grandma Sadie lived in Mount Vernon, New York, and they would visit once or twice a year. They would drive down to our home in Southside, Virginia. I adored Grandpa Herman. I found him fascinating, exotic. He treated me like an equal. He didn't talk down to me. He taught me my first French phrase sitting on his knee. Mademoiselle, vous êtes très gentille, which means, Madam, you are very kind. And I used that phrase a lot as I was growing up, whether it was appropriate or not. I was so proud to have learned that from my grandfather, who was also a classical concert pianist and a revered piano teacher. So I have to say he had an outsized influence on me, according to the amount of time that I spent with him, which was roughly twice a year. Though I did go up and visit when I became a teenager. I would take the train up and visit. He instilled in me a love of the arts, of music, of travel. He certainly lit a fire under me for my sense of adventure and wanting to travel. And so I loved him dearly because he loved me, and I felt unique in his eyes. And I have to say my siblings didn't react quite as well as I did to him. They could take him or leave him, which is understandable.
So was your relationship with him something else that in some ways stood between you and your nuclear family and making you feel different?
Indeed, it did, very much so. My mother, a Gentile, and my grandfather had a shaky relationship. I think it was an uneasy truce after I was born. My Jewish grandparents had not wanted my father to marry a Gentile, but they were always polite around my mother and accepting on the surface. If they had further feelings about it, they never spoke about it. But my mother, I think, was jealous of my relationship with my grandfather and the fact that I was sort of glued to him when he visited. And in a sense, I felt that I was betraying my mother when I showed my grandfather too much affection. And she made note of that. She often called me Little Herman. She would refer to a gesture I would make or a look on my face as, that looks just like Grandpa Herman. And in her world, that was not a compliment. And it effectively marginalized me in my family, so that I was more the Jewish identified kid. Even though I didn't necessarily think of myself as that then, I just thought that side of the family was so much more interesting, fun to be around.
There was another person from outside of your family who had a big impact on you as you were growing up. Tell us about Cora Anderson and what you learned from Cora.
Oh, Cora was my beloved. Cora was the Black housekeeper who came to us when I was, I guess, between 11 and 12, and she was about 18. And she was the big sister I wanted, my best friend, and the mother who gave me more of the attention than my own mother did. I assume because my mother was involved with my younger siblings, their care. So Cora and I also, like my grandfather Herman and I, had a special bond. Cora would roll my hair and comb it out in the mornings, critique my clothes for school. She would make treats for me when I came home. Her I consider world famous handmade cinnamon rolls and French fries, because as a teenager, I was always ravenous when I came home from school. So Cora was everything to me, and I don't know that I'd have made it through my teenage years without Cora's attention and love.
But she was also the way you began to see how race played a role in the small town where you lived and more generally in the South. And race, I think, always has to be present in a Southern story. Um, as a young person, you began to look beyond your immediate family, in part through the eyes of Cora, as well as your grandfather, your Jewish grandfather. Tell us about your growing awareness of racism and prejudice and how that played out in your hometown.
Sure. You have to remember that I grew up in the Jim Crow South. And I think my first exposure, even before getting to know Cora, was when we were traveling the back roads of Pennsylvania County a Sunday afternoon. All the kids, we were all in the car, and we saw a Klan rally break up. I don't remember exactly the details, except that there were the white sheets, and we knew they were the Klan. And we were a distance back, and we saw them get in their cars and come down to the road. We found ourselves in a parade of Klan people, except for an unfortunate car with a family of Black people in front of us. And what happened was the truck behind us pulled around in front of us, and there was a gun rack, and there was the Confederate flag, all of the things that you associate with members of the Klan, and they tried to run the Black family off the road by edging the truck closer and closer to the driver's side of their car. I was horrified, and my parents both said, this is awful. And I said, Dad, can't you do something? They're gonna hurt these people. And I'm sure my father would have liked to have done something, but at the time it would have been dangerous for everybody involved for him to do something. So this was the beginning of my awareness that there were some white people that lived in my town and lived around the town who were not very nice, who were not good people. And then it really hit home in a very personal way with Cora, who I saw no difference between Cora and me. Her skin was a different color, but that was it. And she would go with us on vacation. We would go to the Outer Banks, to Nag's Head, every summer. And we always stopped at a roadside restaurant for lunch on the way. And the first time that happened, I was halfway out of the car. We were going into the restaurant, but Cora didn't get out of the car. And I said, Cora, come on, you have to come in and eat with us. And I didn't understand why she wasn't getting out of the car. And Dad said, Cora, I'll bring your food out to you. And I said, what's going on? Why can't you come in? And Dad just gave me the look, and the look was, be quiet. I've got this under control. So Dad brought food out, and I said, well, if Cora has to eat in the car, I'm gonna eat in the car too. And so we both did. And then I realized, what the, I won't say the word, but I didn't know the word then either. What's going on here? And this is horrible. And then from then on, I knew that we would have to go around to the back of the restaurant, and a hand would come out and shove a plate of food to Cora. And I was incensed by this, and I felt a great passion about the injustice of it. At the same time, when I was in high school, Danville, Virginia, where I grew up, in 1963 was the epicenter of the civil rights movement. A lot of people didn't know about it, but Martin Luther King visited Danville 3 times in 1963, while there were peaceful demonstrations going on by the town's Blacks, wanting to use the public library, wanting to sit at the Woolworth's lunch counter with the rest of us, wanting the same privileges and the same things that we took for granted. Sadly, at the time, I didn't know that was going on. The owner of the Danville Register and Bee was a staunch segregationist, and she would not have her reporters cover the demonstrations. So it wasn't in the paper, it wasn't talked about at school in civics class. Even my schoolmates didn't seem to know about it. Our parents didn't talk about it. It was a kind of unpleasantness that Southerners don't want to bring up. And it was only when I was in my early 30s that I actually learned the full extent of what happened in Danville and the brutality of the way these peaceful demonstrators were treated. And it eventually did make Walter Cronkite. I did know, but I didn't see that broadcast. So those were the things that opened in me a passion for equal rights, not only for Blacks, but for all people who may be different in some way or other from the prevailing culture.
And in fact, you dedicated this book, and I'll quote the dedication, to all who suffer the pain of exclusion through intolerance in all its forms. Is there anything else you'd like to say about that?
Yes, I thought about other dedications, but since this book is about being marginalized, about intolerance, about the psychological impact of that kind of intolerance on a human being, I felt the book had to be dedicated to everyone who has been marginalized, who've been treated badly because of race, color, creed, being LGBTQ, any of those things that makes them considered outside the mainstream when we should be embracing the difference among us, because it brings a richness to our culture and to our society. And it makes my heart hurt that this kind of othering and maltreatment of people who are different is going on still in 2021, when we should have left that far behind. And I'm passionate about us being better than that.
And that passion comes through in the book for sure.
Thank you.
You were in a hurry to leave your hometown and to leave your family. A lot of people are in a hurry to do those things when they're young, and they rush out into the world and they hit a wall. They get smacked up against a wall, and maybe they decide their comfort zone wasn't so bad after all, and they go back where they started. You didn't go back. You kept going. You left a lot of things behind, but at the same time, you're not a person who cuts off family ties. So, what kept you going? What kept you taking risks and cutting your own paths instead of the ones that your father, especially, would have dictated and laid out for you?
Yeah, he wanted me to be a dentist. And when he realized that wasn't going to happen for me, he tried it out on my brother. Didn't happen with my brother either. But I think it was my insatiable curiosity. And I think Grandpa Herman was a big part of that. You know, his stories about Europe and about music and the art books he gave me just lit a fire under me to want to see the world. And I told my parents when I left for college, I said, I love you, but I'm never coming back to Danville to live. I'll visit, but don't expect me to live here. And so I kept up the visits with them as often as I could. There were times when I was out of the country and I wrote regularly, and my mother was very good at writing letters. My dad, not so much. So I stayed in touch with family because I loved them and they were still my family, even though in many ways I'm different from them in the paths that I've chosen.
So, what was it that did keep you connected? You loved them. Beyond that, what kept you connected?
I guess later on we became concerned about our father. Mm-hmm. And as Dad started to deteriorate, both psychologically, emotionally, and physically, we wanted to be there to help support him, to help my mother. And so I especially tried to be a support and a prop to the extent that I could. Mm-hmm. At the time I was pregnant, and then I had my twin sons, whom I adore. So there was only so much I could do, but I tried, and I think my other siblings in their roles, tried to be supportive as well.
And your father did take his own life. You were an adult, but still a young adult with young children of your own at that time. You wrote about, of course, this is what you wrote the book about, and it was decades later that you wrote the book. As time went by, how did your understanding of your father and what he chose to do, how did that change as you lived your own life?
Well, I wrote about my father not incessantly, but throughout my adult life, because I've been a writer most of my adult life. In essays, I wrote about his World War II experience for the newspaper, and I was kind of obsessed, and I couldn't get past it. There was something keeping me from understanding why he would take himself away from us, why he would leave us in such a brutal way. I couldn't wrap my mind around it, and it haunted me. So all that culminated, all the writing short pieces culminated in writing the book. And it was finally through the book and my memories and pulling together memories from childhood and memories throughout my adulthood until his death that I was able to understand a little bit better why he did what he did. And I think, it was a Gordian knot, my father's feelings that he never shared, his impulses. I was able to tease out a few strands, and those were his pain, his physical pain. Being a dentist is hard on the back, and he suffered from that. His depression, which was unacknowledged even by him, but it was genetic. His mother, my grandma Sadie, had been given electroshock therapy to bring her out of these catatonic depressive states that she had. And thirdly, and I think just as importantly, and maybe most importantly, was the fact that my father felt he was a failure at blending in, at being a Southern Baptist, at being a good old Southern boy. He had a nose job, so he wouldn't look so Jewish. He affected a bit of a drawl. He had hunting and fishing buddies who were working class people. Dad never met a stranger, and he didn't care a fig for social class and caste. So he was friends with a lot of folks. And he ran for public office twice, once for city council, and then when he bought property, the farm property, and built a house there, he ran for county commissioner, lost both elections. And when he lost his election for county commissioner, he told my mother he was a failure. And I think what he meant by failure was he had failed as a man who gave up his identity. He had failed in living fully his new identity and being accepted in that identity. Because he certainly, by all outward appearances, was not a failure. He was extremely successful in his dental practice. He owned property at the lake. He owned property in Danville. He made great business decisions. He made a lot of money. And so to all outward appearances, he was a huge success. And yet there was this self-hatred that I felt he had. And these things came to a head in ways that were tragic and painful to watch. And we thought, since he was on 24-hour suicide watch at UVA Hospital, that he would be protected from himself. But my father, being the resourceful, incredibly intelligent and determined man that he was able to kill himself despite all the precautions that were taken.
It's a lot to have to work through. It takes a lifetime, doesn't it?
It does take a lifetime, but I feel now that I'm at peace with it, and I understand it better than I did before, and I'm not tormented by it the way I have been most of my life.
Good. I want to quote from something you say in your author's note at the front of the book. You write, "I wrote this memoir from the heart and soul of the girl I once was through the lens of the woman I have become." And that is a theme that I see emerging throughout the book. It's one of finding your own truth and your own reconciliation with that truth. And we talk about truth and reconciliation as something that the world may need, that our community may need, and then again, it's something that individuals need. Towards the end of the book, there's a very dramatic series of events. And can you talk a little bit about that ending and talk about it through the lens of truth and reconciliation?
That's a great question, Nora, and a great way to frame the end of the book. I have to lead into the last chapter by saying that I was estranged from my cousins on my Gentile side, David and Joe. They were not educated. They used the N-word, and Joe, as a young boy, collected Nazi memorabilia and had a swastika flag hanging in his bedroom next to his bed. We visited them regularly because these were the sons of my mother's twin sister. And I hated those visits. I was uncomfortable around them. And David turned out to be a sexual predator. I knew it almost instinctively, and I was afraid of him. So they were not a part of my life when I left home. David died young of a heart attack, and Joe was the only one left on my mother's side of the family at the point of the last chapter of this book. And his father, my uncle, had been given ashes from Dachau because he had served in World War II as a messenger, while my father was serving as top turret gunner and bombardier. He went to Dachau at the end of the war and was given a tour of the prison camp by a former prisoner. And at the end of the tour, the prisoner scooped up what was later determined to be an ash cake, sort of compacted ashes, and gave them to my uncle, telling him, "I give you this so that you will never forget what happened here." My uncle was so traumatized by that, I think, that he put those ashes in a drawer and kept them a secret for 70 years. And it was only the year that he was dying that he told my cousin Joe about them. And then my cousin Joe hid them for another decade or more. But Joe had several heart attacks and knew that his life was nearing its end, and he didn't want to die without us knowing about these ashes. So they eventually came to me, and I eventually came around to Joe to ask him about the ashes, how they came to be in his possession. I wanted to make sure that they were real. And I also enlisted a wonderful woman who is the co-founder of the Holocaust Speakers Bureau for the Triangle area. And gee, I'm having a senior moment, and I'm blocking on her name. It'll come up in a minute. But anyway, Sharon Halperin. Sharon is a mover and shaker, and she was the one who helped me with the ashes. Her husband is a dean at a medical school in New York, and he took the ashes and had them authenticated through the New York Medical Examiner's Office, the same office that examined the remains from 9/11. And the examiner's office authenticated the ashes as human remains. So this allowed us to go forward with planning a burial with full rights for these ashes. In Jewish tradition, cremation is not allowed, but it is allowed in the case where people were cremated against their will, as certainly was the case in the death camps. So there was a tent set up, and my cousin Joe came from his home in rural Dobson, North Carolina. He had been ordained through the internet, I think, but he wore his clerical robes, his Christian robes, And then there were Sharon and two rabbis who spoke, and they were all together under this one tent. There I was with the two halves of my heritage, and feeling somewhat that I had a foot in each camp, but belonged fully to neither. But I was reconciled with Joe, with the person he was, and reconciled to how he became because of his own upbringing, and that he had changed, even though we were still different in our political and religious beliefs. The very end, where the ashes are being placed in the grave, there were Holocaust survivors there with the numbers tattooed on their arms. They were elderly, some with canes, but they filed by the grave and they threw dirt, handfuls of dirt onto the small casket, saying, "For my father, for my mother, for my sister, for my brother." And this was heartbreaking. And I threw dirt and I said, under my breath, "For my father and for my grandfather." And for me, this was closure in a way that I'd never imagined. And I ended the book with a prayer, the Jewish prayer for the dead, which has the title of the book, "Let Them Bind Him with the Rope of Life," because I wanted my father's soul bound with the rope of life. So
It's a beautiful ending, Miranda, excuse me. I think it's time for us to open up for questions from people who've joined us on Facebook. And I think Natalie's going to help with that.
yes, and I want to thank all of you who took the time from your day to tune in and listen to me. It means more than you can possibly know that you have joined me for this event. And I welcome any questions you have. A few, I'm told.
These are in no particular order. So.
Okay, in no particular order.
Yeah, well, really quickly, Rebecca had mentioned that she missed why your dad was alive. If you could just touch on that. That was a small
Yes.
question.
Someone asked why my dad was hospitalized so many times, and it was for back pain. He was given physical therapy. He had 2 back surgeries from which he had to recover, and the back pain became intractable, at least for him. I think the pain was mixed together with his depression, but he was hospitalized many times to help with the pain, and he just bounced around from one hospital to another. And it wasn't until UVA where his depression and his mental illness was acknowledged, and he was given psychiatric evaluation and treatment.
So now that, another question so now that the book has been published, how is connecting to those who have read it added a new dimension?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. How has publishing the book and connecting with the people who've read it added a new dimension for me? And I'm just thrilled. I love you all out there. I've got nothing but positive feedback, and I've heard from people that I went to high school with, and people who learned something through my book, who felt they could identify with my book, who could identify with what I went through. I have to say the Jewish side of my family, and they're all second and third cousins because my dad was an only child, have reached out. They have said wonderful things to me about the book. So it's been a huge gift, the reaction of people like you out there. Just a huge gift to my heart, the way my book has been received, because I really put it out there, and I felt extremely vulnerable, and the fact that you have received me so well means the world to me.
Great. Well, so another question is, did your dad ever discuss his feelings or conflict with your dad in that relationship?
Oh, the question was about my dad's relationship with his own father, Grandpa Herman. I think from the little I knew about Dad growing up, that they had a strained relationship. My mother told me that my dad wasn't planned for, and I don't think that my grandparents had intended to be parents. And I suspect that my grandfather wasn't the best dad. He was very caught up with his music, with concertizing, with teaching. He went to Europe every summer. He had friends all over Europe. And I'm not sure that he had a lot of time for his own son. Um, as a grown-up, and when I was around, my dad and my grandfather seemed to get along okay. They were respectful of each other. There was love between them. But my father never talked much about my grandfather. He wouldn't talk about his childhood that much. What I learned from my mother. And he seemed to have a distance but loving relationship with my grandfather, as all my father's relationships were. They were emotionally distant.
Great. So another question we have is, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but are there any reflections you might offer about the tensions or dynamics of racism versus anti-Semitism if you experience the latter, or if you can experience the latter?
The question is, were there any differences between the racism I saw and the anti-Semitism that I may or may not have experienced? And can I talk more about the latter? Does that address it? Well, in my own experience, and I can't speak for other Jews because other Jews have had more different experiences, and because I'm half a Jew and half Gentile, maybe I wasn't treated as badly as some Jews I know have been treated. But I have to say that the racism I saw was horrible, and it hurt me deeply. The anti-Semitism I experienced was in the manner of Southern gentility. Southerners don't like to come right out and say what they're thinking, but I do remember an instance at the Woolworths lunch counter, the Woolworths lunch counter. I was sitting with my mother, and there was a man on the other side of her whom we didn't know, but he started talking about the city council election and asked my mother who she was going to vote for. But before she had a chance to speak, he said, well, I know who I'm not going to vote for, and it's that Yankee Jew, Hugh Kossoff. If he thinks he can be city council for this town, he's got another thing coming. And I could see my mother's face flame up, and I wanted to either crawl in the hole or punch the man in the face. I was sort of torn between the two reactions, but I was horrified that anyone would say that about my dad. And in Christian Sunday school, I was asked to explain the Jewish holidays to the other students. And at the time, I didn't know because I'd been raised a Southern Baptist. So I said, well, I don't know because I'm Southern Baptist like you. And there was one instance when I was in college when my mother was going to visit, and I reserved a room at an inn in Williamsburg for her. And I just said I wanted a room for my mother. Do you have, when I called the gentleman, do you have a room? And he said yes. He required a deposit. So I walked to the inn and knocked on the door, and I said, I'm here, and I'm here to make a deposit on the room that you were saving for me. And he said, and what would the name be? And I said, well, my mother's name is Nancy Kossoff. And then he got all frosty when he heard my last name. And he said, oh, I'm sorry, we don't have any room. And I said, but you were holding the room for me. That's why I'm coming to pay you the deposit. And he closed the door in my face. Now, there may have been, maybe something else happened. Maybe I'm being oversensitive. But in my mind, he closed the door on me because I had a Jewish sounding last name. Otherwise, I can only speak for myself, and I haven't felt discriminated against because of my name. And probably because I've picked my friends, and I live in a very embracing community. And I lived in Durham most of my adult life, and I loved Durham. And I love the fact that Durham was 40% Black. And I have Jewish friends, and they mean a lot to me. So I think I've gone on far too long about this, but I hope this answered your question.
All right, got a long question here. From Lauren Benedict. I had the distinct impression while reading your book that your father was at times trying to rebel from his Eastern European, Jewish, and artistic background, referring to his father, and was possibly attempting to reinvent himself as a Southern good old boy of sorts. So firstly, would you say that this interpretation has some truth to it? And secondly, how would you describe his aims in life in relation to his beginnings beyond what you might have written in your book?
Oh, wow. This was a multi-layered question, and I'm not sure I can get all of it, but thank you, Lauren. This is from Lauren Benedict, my stepson, who read the book, yes. And my stepdaughter is also watching, Sherry Benedict, and my son, Andy Danzer, who I'm delighted to have be with me for this event. So what Lauren was asking was whether my father, in choosing the life he did, was rebelling against his Eastern European heritage and his growing up, and was trying to reinvent himself as a Southern good old boy. And I think, what was the last part of that?
Would you say that this interpretation has some truth to it? And secondly, how would you describe his aims in life in relation to the beginnings beyond what you might have written in your book?
Okay, do I think there's some truth to this? Absolutely. And what might have been his aims in life beyond what I've written about? I can only say that he aimed to be successful. He aimed to be a good father. I don't think he had a good template for being a good father. So in his way, in his not being someone who was reflective or self-aware, in his way, he tried to be a good father. I think that was one of his aims. His aim was to see his children educated, and his aim was to be accepted as a Southern Baptist, as one of the Danville good old boys. I don't think he even aimed to be one of the aristocrats of Danville. Danville had its upper crust that were very set apart from the rest of Danville. And we jokingly referred to them as the first families of Virginia. And my dad didn't attempt to be part of that class. He just wanted to be accepted as a good old boy. And so I think his aims were to be a good dentist, a good father, a successful man, make money, which he did, and live a good life. But unfortunately, mental illness got in the way, and I think his own lack of introspection. And we also wondered if he wasn't bipolar, because my dad was a very busy man when he was active. I hope that answers your question, Lauren. It was a great question.
So, speaking of how your son is actually on the Zoom call today, someone asked, how did your sons relate to this book?
Someone has asked me how my sons related to this book. It's a great question. I haven't really spoken to, my sons are twins. I haven't spoken to my other son, whom I refer to as Max in the book. I did ask him in a text, what did you think of the book? And he responded that he thought Grandpa Herman sounded really cool. My son, who's watching, is referred to as Drew in the book. And he has said that he read the book and he thought it was well written. Beyond that, he and I haven't had a long conversation about it. I will say that my stepdaughter, Sherry, wrote me a beautiful email, a long and beautiful email about her reactions to the book and how brave she thought I was in putting it all out there, how much it meant to her, how much she learned about me that she didn't know, because she and I have only been relatives by marriage with each other for 14 years. And it was just a beautiful email. And Sherry, I thank you for that from the bottom of my heart. It just meant the world to me.
So Rebecca McLaughlin Mayer asked, did you see your mom as brave, rebellious, or in love when she married your father, and in love when she married your father?
Oh, Rebecca, thank you. I think you asked me another question. Excuse me. I'm gonna get my water. I'm getting hoarse, which happens when I run my mouth too much.
That's a great question.
Yes, these are wonderful questions. So this question was about my mother. Did I think she was brave? And what else?
Brave, rebellious, and in love.
Brave, rebellious, and in love to marry my father. I think my mother was brave. I don't know that she was rebellious. My mother clung to her fundamentalist upbringing and was extremely close to her mother. Her father died in the Spanish flu epidemic when she was 2, so she never knew her real father. So she was very much a traditionalist. I do think she was brave to marry my dad, and brave to marry a guy who was almost a decade younger than she. Though later in life, she told me at the time she didn't know Dad was so young, and she didn't really understand much about his Judaism. My own take on it was my mother was 30 when Dad came back into her life after he got back from the war. And at that time, she was going to be considered a spinster, and there weren't a lot of eligible men around. So many were killed in the war, and certainly in those last few years, there weren't any men around. They were all at the front. So here was an opportunity to marry a handsome, rather dashing man with a lot of plans for the future. And so yeah, I think she was brave, and she stepped out of her comfort zone for that. And I do think she was in love with this sort of swashbuckling character that my dad was at the time.
Great. Well, I think that wraps up about all the questions about the work of life itself, but there are 2 more questions just about you as an author in general that I'm going to kind of tie into one question, which is, have you written at all about your beautiful art and jewelry, and are you working on another book? So yes,
Thank you for that. The last question is, have I written about my, excuse me, have I written about my jewelry? And no, I really haven't. I've written about art and creativity and writing and creativity in a more general way. And the second part of that question is, am I working on another book? And yes, I am. I'm procrastinating a bit right now, but I am definitely working on another book, and I'm excited about it, and it won't be as painful to write as this one was. But I hope that people will like it and relate to it the way they have to this book. So thank you everyone. I love you, thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Nora, thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Mirinda. See you soon.
And I'll pop on in here and just say thank you everybody for tuning in. I'm sorry if some people had some problems with the volume, but good news, it is on our Facebook page, so you can rewatch it as many times as you would like. And I did put in the comments section a link to be able to buy the book from McIntyre's if you don't already have a copy. We also you can visit our website and access a link to McIntyre's there too. Thank you so much, Mirinda. I know your story is emotional, evocative, heavy, and it's just an amazing story, and you tell it so beautifully. So thank you for sharing this experience. Thank you so much, Nora, for your wonderful questions. And we are in Frank Gallery, and we are open Tuesday through Saturday. If anybody wants to come and visit, we are open 12 to 5 or by appointment, and here to answer any of your questions that you have about any of our artists. And thank you so much.
And yes, you should come.
Yes, it's a really beautiful.
The art is gorgeous, and it's high class, high caliber art. And I encourage all of you who haven't been here to stop by and at least visit. But you can buy great jewelry here in addition to paintings, sculpture, ceramics, lots of beautiful stuff.
Not only do you want to get Mirinda's book, but you should probably buy a matching necklace of hers to go with it. And we have a new exhibit up that's featuring Sasha Bakarich, John Rosenthal, Ippy Patterson, and Holly Fisher, and it's stunning. And we hope that everybody gets a chance to visit. And thank you so much for all of your lovely comments and questions. We will be sharing them with Mirinda. So thank you. Have a great day. And thank you to Avery, our wonderful Frank intern who does all sorts of great things. And we love her. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.